Okay, let's get started. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Birte Snilstveit, and I'm the Director for Synthesis and Reviews at 3IE. And it's my great pleasure to be chairing this panel on what's the current evidence on interventions to reduce energy consumption and mitigate the effects of climate change. So a hugely important topic, and also timely considering the COP coming up. So we have three panelists with us today. So we'll start with Martin Prowse from the Green Climate Fund, who will share a couple of examples, I think, of recent work that they've done in mapping and reviewing evidence. And then we'll have Miriam Berretta from 3IE, who will share some findings on mapping and reviewing the evidence on energy efficiency. And then finally, we'll have Minx from the Mercator Research Institute on Global Commons and Climate Change, MCC, who will discuss the findings from a systematic review of behavioral interventions to reduce energy consumption. So the panelists will speak for up to 15 minutes. So they'll present the findings of their research, and then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So for the audience, I'd like to ask you to post your questions using the Q&A function. There is also the chat, but if you can use the chat for if you'd like to introduce yourself or just make general comments. But any specific questions that you'd like to be put to the audience, it would be helpful if you can use the Q&A function for that. So with that introduction, I'm handing over to Martin.
Thank you, Birte, for the kind introduction, and it's a pleasure and a privilege to be on this panel alongside yourself and Jan and Miriam. And I'll introduce two areas of work that the Independent Evaluation Unit has completed on reducing energy consumption and mitigating climate change, two evidence reviews. So the first of these is an evidence review on mitigation interventions in the private sector in developing countries, and this was completed with a range of colleagues from within the IU, as well as AAE, a consulting firm who we engaged for this particular work. So the overarching research question that the evidence review responded to was what evidence exists with respect to the effectiveness and efficiency of climate change mitigation interventions in the private sector in developing countries. And the first challenge that we had with this piece of work was how to define the private sector. And we finalized this through expert guidance and a set of interviews. And we focused the evidence review on actors who were the owner of a climate change mitigation asset. So the asset being technology or infrastructure, devices, buildings, etc. And also interventions where the private sector was performing a key financial intermediation service. So these were the two ways in which we defined the private sector for this evidence review. The PICOs for this evidence review was firstly non-Annex 1 countries. Secondly, interventions or climate change mitigation interventions, including reducing energy consumption, decreasing greenhouse gas emissions, either through the ownership of physical assets or through regulatory components, as well as cross-cutting projects, both adaptation and mitigation projects. The comparator for the evidence included in the review was the no mitigation intervention scenario. We included studies that had different levels of intervention and also studies that used a time series approach. The outcomes that we focused on were the direct measurement of greenhouse gas reduction, as well as indirect measures. So here we focused on changes in energy consumption and generation patterns, behavioral change, such as in transportation, appliance use consumption, and also importantly, co-impacts. and we included both quantitative and mixed method studies. So the theory of change that we utilized for this evidence review highlights that within our enabling environment, we included the tax policy regulations, awareness, and de-risking instruments, but the asset owners that we focused on were either corporate, firm, or household asset owners. We focused on 4 types of interventions: fossil fuel substitution, energy efficiency, capture and storage, and sustainable management. Our final outcomes were greenhouse gas reductions in terms of emission reductions, efficiency, sequestration, and capture and storage, as well as co-impacts. But we also included intermediate outcomes, such as changes in energy consumption patterns, generation patterns, and behavioral change. And we also included, as the box in the bottom illustrates, the role of the private sector in terms of financial intermediation. So overall, we cast the net widely and pulled in around 7,500 studies, but after abstract screening and full text screening, we only retained 32 studies for inclusion in this evidence gap map. Those 32 studies were focused strongly in China, in India, in Kenya, and in Brazil. In terms of continents, most of the studies were in sub-Saharan Africa. Out of the 32 papers, 68 intervention outcomes were coded, and 26 of these were based on causal analysis, and 42 were based on non-experimental and other approaches. When we look at the outcome areas that the studies focused on, we can see a very strong emphasis on energy, both in terms of greenhouse gas emission, direct greenhouse gas emission measurement, as well as intermediate outcomes. We could also see a number of studies in industry, waste management, and agriculture and livestock. We coded the projects and investments using multiple intervention types, and this yielded 98 project investment interventions. And here we can see how these are categorized according to these intervention types. So we can see very, very clearly in terms of interventions, the majority of interventions focused on fossil fuel substitution and energy efficiency, and a full range of other intervention types only comprise around 20% or less, in fact, less than that. And this includes avoided desertification, reforestation, afforestation, forest, and improved husbandry. In terms of outcomes, we see a very similar breakdown in terms of the dominance of outcomes from fossil fuel substitution and energy efficiency, and we see a number of outcomes focused on intermediary outcomes. We compared the EGM with an intervention heat map based on GCF-funded activities within the private sector up to November 2020. And here we see that the GCF portfolio tallies and mirrors the evidence base with a focus on energy. And in fact, almost all of the GCF funds that are tagged and earmarked as coming from the private sector focused on energy. So this included 32 specific projects up to November 2020 that were tagged as private sector projects focused on mitigation. Mitigation or cross-cutting projects, I should add. So the messages from this evidence review are that the largest share of the available evidence is in the energy and industrial sectors, especially fossil fuel substitution and energy efficiency measures. We have gaps in terms of the evidence base, in terms of buildings, urban planning, reforestation, afforestation, avoiding desertification, and soil and fertilizer management. Few studies have focused on employment co-benefits and intermediate outcomes, such as behavior change. Finally, much of the GCF private sector portfolio covers any energy-related interventions, and PCF or private sector facility interventions in other sectors has really highlighted has highlighted a limited number of studies in those areas. So that's the first study that I wanted to highlight to you and to feed back to you. The second study focuses on transformational change. So this is a learning exercise about what we can learn about transformational change in the energy sector and also in behavioral change in public health. And this again has been completed with a wide range of colleagues from the climate investment funds and Neha Sharma in particular, and also the Center for Evaluation and Development, University of Mannheim, in particular Arne Weiss. So the overarching research question for this evidence review was what causal evidence on transformational change exists in energy and behavioral change in public health to inform climate change mitigation and adaptation interventions in low and middle income countries. So we define transformational change as large impacts sustained over time at a large scale. The PICOs are that there were at least 1,000 individual beneficiaries or an entire administrative unit targeted in the low or middle income countries. In terms of energy, we focused on interventions that related to institutional and market systems, incentives and standards, soft interventions and investments in infrastructure. I won't go into the health behavioral change in public health component in this presentation. The comparator was also a clearly defined and comparable control group. So we had a very strict emphasis on causal designs. And in terms of outcomes for energy, it was mitigation or adaptation, labor market co-benefits, or the transition into renewable energy. And so we used experimental, quasi-experimental designs where outcomes or impacts were measured at least 1 year after the onset of the intervention. So this is a theory of change for this particular evidence review on energy. So the interventions we looked at were institutional and market systems, incentives and standards, investments in energy infrastructure, equipment and technologies, and as well as soft interventions. So education, persuasion, training, restructuring, modeling, enablement. This is a theory of change for the behavioral change in public health component. So here we use the COM-B framework and utilized and operationalized the intervention functions within that, but I won't detail that in this presentation. So within the evidence review, we dragged in 24,186 studies. However, after abstract screening and full text screening, we only included 144 studies for inclusion in the EGM. And we also completed some meta-analysis within this evidence review. And the number of full text articles retained for inclusion in the meta-analysis were 53 in public health and only 31 in energy. So the findings from our meta-analysis in energy. So the first cell in the EGM that we focused on, where there was a saturation in terms of causal studies, was the effect of electrification on formal employment. So this is a co-benefit. So one of our meta-analyses focused on a co-benefit. And the meta-analysis found or estimated a 2% increase in formal employment, mainly driven by greater employment of women, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. However, when sensitivity and heterogeneity tests were applied, this estimate needs to be revised down due to, for example, publication bias. The large effects were found in many published papers, and the small effects were found in many of the studies in the grey literature. The estimated effect size for transformational change of 0.03 was considerably below the small effect size of 0.2 or the effect size that we estimated for transformational change of 0.8. And there were many contextual factors here that we didn't explore in these results. The second cell of the EGM that had saturation in terms of meta-analysis was the effect of emissions trading schemes on greenhouse gas emissions. So here we found a surprisingly large reduction in emissions from one specific pilot emission trading scheme, which was the Chinese pilot emission trading scheme. And we found a reduction of emissions of 17% and a Cohen's D value of -1. So this is considerable, is over our threshold for transformational change. within the set of studies, limited set of studies that were evaluated. However, again, when we looked into publication bias and heterogeneity effects, we found good reasons to be cautious around this particular result. So our approach to meta-analysis was that we calculated the standardized effect size of Cohen's d. We used a random effects model, given the large heterogeneity in our studies, and the tests that we conducted within the meta-analysis, the robustness tests, if you like, included sensitivity analysis, subgroup analysis, outlier detection, Egger tests, and funnel plots. So that brings us to the end of these two very rapid presentations. I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll hand back to Birte.
Thank you, Martin. Some really interesting findings there that hopefully we can get back to during the discussion. So I'll ask Miriam to share your screen, and over to you.
Sure, thank you. Can you hear and see the presentation?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So thank you very much. Today I will present an evidence gap map and assessment reviews we conducted last year on energy efficiency intervention. So we were two different teams, but some people were part of both teams, mostly coming from TRI, but also from other institutes. And Minx here present today also contributed to the EGM. The founder of the project was the can you still hear me?
It's breaking up a little, for me at least.
Okay, I'll try again. So the project has been funded by the Independent Evaluation Function with the European Investment Bank. And since the beginning, the project wanted to focus on climate change issues. So we did a scoping exercise to see which topics could have been synthesized. And we noticed that for many topics, for example, circular economy or adaptation, there wasn't much evidence. While for other topics there were already some ongoing works. So at the end, we end up on energy efficiency area because it was of interest for the IEB, and it seems that there was evidence. So the PICOs for the evidence gap map, in terms of population, we look at all over the world at household, public institution, business, and firms. And we look at any intervention that aim to increase energy efficiency at those three levels. In terms of outcomes, we look at environmental energy outcomes, but also other intermediate outcomes that include behavioral change and socioeconomic outcomes. In terms of studies, we look at experimental and quasi-experimental design, impact evaluations, and systematic reviews. And out of more than 46,000 studies retrieved through our academic and grey literature research, we included a total of 299 studies, 16 of which were systematic reviews. So the evidence is concentrated on two interventions group areas, and in particular, most of the studies look at what is called monitoring displaying energy consumption, that include interventions that help, for example, households to monitor how much energy they use. But there were also a lot of studies around education and campaigns and provision of energy efficiency technology or services, and also around subsidies and monitoring incentives. And most of the evaluations targeted households. We didn't find much evidence on public institutions or firms and businesses. So in terms of outcomes, most of these studies look at the energy net saving consumption, but we also found some studies looking at behavioral change outcomes, including adoption of energy saving behaviors and changes in awareness and attitudes. but we also only found 21 studies that reported at least one energy and one socioeconomic outcome. And most of the studies were conducted in high-income countries. So you can see here that most of them were in the United States and Europe, and only 25% of the studies were conducted in low and middle-income countries. So this is the map. You probably know evidence gap maps, but just to remind, the empty boxes here show the completely gaps in the evidence base. The cluster of evidence indicates that there is a synthesis gap. So for example, here we have big gray bubbles, which indicate quite a lot of impact evaluations, and orange and red bubbles that indicate systematic reviews of low and medium confidence, meaning that we can't completely trust the results for some issues on how this review was conducted. So these represent synthesis gaps, because we would like to see high confidence systematic reviews here. And so from the EGM, we identified some synthesis gaps, which were around the provision of technologies, energy efficiency technologies, including also, for example, cook stoves, in particular in low and middle income countries, or energy efficiency technologies such as the installation of them, that we'll see then in this review in a moment. There was a cluster around education campaigns, and also around energy pricing incentives to reduce energy consumption. And then we saw there were a lot of studies around monitoring displaying of energy consumption. So from the EGM, we used the findings of the EGM to develop the systematic review scope. And we consulted stakeholders, we looked at the synthesis gaps in the EGM, and we were also aware of other ongoing works. So in the EGM, we identified 28 studies that evaluated the effect of energy efficiency building upgrades. So as you saw, there were many other synthesis gaps. By consulting with our stakeholder and looking at the evidence base, we decided that this was a good area to conduct a systematic review. So we look at the effect of energy efficiency technologies in buildings. And then there was also a lot of evidence around behavioral interventions, but we were aware of another systematic reviews conducted by Ian Minx, here present today, on energy consumption. So we did not obviously do another systematic review on the same topic. So this is a brief tier change of the intervention outcomes we look at. So we look at what is called energy efficiency measures that include, for example, the insulation of the attic loft walls of a building, the replacement of a boiler or furnace for a more efficient one, heating control systems, passive cooling control systems, energy efficiency lighting, windows, and door upgrades. And then we were also interested in these measures matched with what we call information provision interventions, which were interventions where additional information, for example, on how to use the technology was provided to the households. So we only look at the household level here. And so the output would have been obviously more energy efficient buildings, and then the household more informed on how to use the energy efficiency improvements for that second category of intervention. We identified some pre-intermediate outcomes, increase awareness, for example, and how to use the energy efficiency technology, but those pre-intermediate outcomes were not exactly necessary or always present to reach the intermediate outcomes and the final outcomes that we look at in the review. And so the household outcomes level, there were various outcomes of interest, including lower energy consumption, more disposable income, less energy poverty, bettering your air quality, for example. And then at the societal outcomes, reduce emissions, CO2 emissions was an outcome of interest, better air quality, and more jobs created. And obviously, this is should lead to long-term impacts of mitigated climate change and long-term socioeconomic benefits. We also took into consideration some moderating contextual factors, which include the climate, housing characteristics, household characteristics, and regulatory context. And so we retrieved from our search, we retrieved a total of more than 13,000 studies, and we included a total of 16 studies. So similarly to the EGM, most of the studies were located in high-income countries, and in particular in the United States and Europe. But we also found one study in Ethiopia, for example, and one in Ukraine. So most of the studies look at what we call a bundle of intervention. So it wasn't the implementation of only one technology, but more than one. So for example, the replacement of windows and the insulation of the walls, etc. But other studies look at the replacement of boiler heat pumps only, and other for the loft attic insulation only. In terms of contextual information, most of the studies, actually all the studies, all interventions were partially or fully subsidized by governments, university, or a mix of them. And 4 studies look at specifically at low-income households. So in terms of the results of the meta-analysis, this is an example of a first plot of bundle intervention that vary by household. So these were bundles different for each household, and they were different because before to implement intervention, the team conducted an audit to understand which were the best measure for the specific context and households. So here we can see from the average effect that there was a reduction in energy consumption of minus 0.36 standardized mean difference. And you can also see that the results are presented differently by climate. And this is because these interventions obviously are affected by the climate they're implemented in. So we divided the studies based on their location by colder and warmer climate studies using what is called the heating degree days, which indicate how much in degrees the outside air temperature was lower than a base temperature. And this base temperature, for example, in Europe is 15.5 Celsius degrees. And so this is a measure that is used to calculate the energy consumption required to heat a building. So you can see here that for this bundle intervention, the final results are quite positive in the sense that for both the cold climate and the warm climate, there was a reduction of energy consumption, around 37 here and 33 here. But then we also conducted meta-analysis on the reduction on energy consumption by single interventions. So we look at the compact fluorescent light bulbs. There were 2 studies that look at that, and the meta-analysis results was significant, and it was a reduction of 0.29 standardized mean difference. And just to give you a reference point, this was a reduction of around 400 kilowatts per hour per household per year, while the bundles intervention led to a reduction of up to more than 4,000 kilowatts per hour per year per household. So they were obviously highly effective on that side. The other point to note is that there were no studies with a low risk of bias here in the fluorescent light bulbs. And in total, we found only 3 studies with a low risk of bias in this review. So that's obviously it's an issue. And so we also look at attic loft insulation interventions. 3 studies were conducted in colder climate and one study in warmer climates. As you can see, there is still a reduction in energy consumption, but these results are not significant. The meta-analysis results are not significant. Then the single studies show reduction in energy consumption. The results were significant, but the meta-analysis one is not. And here we had 2 studies with low risk of bias. And then finally, we also look at electric heat pump interventions. Only 2 studies look at this kind of intervention. And while in the colder climate, there was a reduction in energy consumption, but again, this wasn't significant here. In one study, we noticed an increase in energy consumption. And this is what is called also the rebound effect, which is when there is an intervention to reduce energy consumption, but actually then the households use more energy. And so in this case, there was one study with low risk of bias. And the reason for this increase is that there were installed these heat pumps, but people started to use, it was in New Zealand, this study, and people started to use these heat pumps also for air conditioning in summer, which is something they never done before. They never had air conditioning before. And so now they start using these heat pumps, not only in winter for the heating, which is the reason why they were installed, but also in summer. So this is an example of how the context can really change the direction of the outcomes, of the expected outcomes. So briefly on the main implications, as you can see, there is limited, there are very limited evidence, and generally quality is very low. But overall, this intervention seems to be effective in reduced energy consumption, although we need more evidence to be able to draw more robust conclusions. All the interventions were subsidized. So this means that these are quite expensive interventions, and there is always the need for financial support, especially for low-income households. Context matters. As you can see, a rebound effect can happen, and it occurs. And there might also be defects in installing or using the energy efficiency measures. So when conducting studies, it's important to provide household with information, which is something we didn't find in any of these studies, the provision of information on the technologies. And then finally, some studies estimated that this intervention can lead to cost savings, but others also identified more or negative cost effectiveness. But also here we need more evidence. And finally, there are almost no studies in low and middle income countries, as you can see. So thank you very much. I hope this was clear.
Thank you, Miriam. Very nice and clear. So I'll just hand straight over to Jan.
Thank you. I'm just trying to, yeah, here we go. So can you see my screen?
Yep.
Excellent. Yeah, so thanks for having me. I want to talk a little bit about the mitigation potential from lifestyle change. It's a bit broader than the reviewer will be presenting, but it's kind of the broader outlook we have on this issue. I just as a note, so I'm using here mainly the slides that have been produced by my colleague Tarun Khanna, who has been leading on these activities here at MCC. I would like to start to give the bigger picture in terms of, where we have to go with in terms of climate change mitigation. And here you see from the special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees from the IPCC that came out in 2018, 4 kind of representative future scenarios with that are representative for different kinds of worlds. And the P1 world, for example, is actually a world with lots of social and business and technological innovations in the world. P4 is one where, even though we are doing we are doing ambitious climate change mitigation, it's still a resource and energy intensive world. And what you see from the scenario literature is actually that those P1 scenarios have a lot of co-benefits and much fewer risks attached, and therefore are desirable. And one of the features behind those types of scenarios is the importance of lifestyle change and radical energy efficiency improvements. But there is a kind of problem in the climate change community, because there is little consolidated knowledge on the potential and role of behavioral change, but also more generally on the effectiveness of policy interventions. What we tried in an editorial when we founded the Campbell Group on climate solutions, what we tried to emphasize here is that the climate community has actually been quite good at, horizon scanning, I would say. So the systematic evaluation of alternative futures. And there it has been really effective in learning from primary research and bring that into scientific assessments via evidence synthesis activities. But this is not so much the case for ex post evidence synthesis and learning, what climate solutions work well under what conditions and why, and also in general on subject matters around behavioral change and lifestyle change. So, and this is an important gap that actually needs to be filled so that we can actually much better understand, how to move forward on this. And this all is also highly or substantiated by this commentary from Tom Dietz in PNAS, where he also outlined, motivated by a study that came out at the time, that those energy use and energy savings tend to be really not well represented in the climate change discussion, and usually underestimated. So a real inspiration for us was then his 2009 PNAS paper, where he estimated short-term mitigation wedge for US households, where he started from climate relevant behaviors in two sectors, the transport and the building sectors, and then looked at the plasticity of change, which is the share of non-adopters that could take action based on interventions. And I think that is a kind of a very useful study, because it brings this behavioral component into horizon scanning activities, because models have been shown to be not too good in that type of thing. So they included basically weatherization, equipment maintenance, adjustments, and daily use actions. So quite comprehensively, and then basically highlighted in their study that there is actually a substantial 2030 emission reduction wedge from behavioral change. We started from this kind of framework in our study that was published this year in Nature Energy, but we focused only on the building sector, and in particular residential buildings, and then basically only on the maintenance, adjustments, and daily use actions in our synthesis. So we looked at reducing energy consumption by behavioral change with short-term plasticity. And we basically, we included 5 types of interventions for doing so. So monetary incentives, information, feedbacks, social comparison, and also motivation. Our philosophy in terms of trying to approach the search was that we said, okay, because it's a very multidisciplinary field, let's try to search very broadly. So we had a broad search query which returned 64,000 or almost 65,000 studies. And then we basically used the machine learning assisted methodology to screen them, but we didn't screen them all. We only screened 6,000. But in each iteration, basically, we estimated based on our ratings, what are the likely, what are the most likely publications that are similar to the ones that we have selected, and that saved us a lot of time. We've actually published a methodological paper on how this can be done in a sound way separately. So I only would like to flag this. So we've found 122 studies after full text screening, which were also highlighted in comparison to other reviews that had been undertaken, that we were more comprehensive than what had been done before. Also, if we consider the respective timeframes. What we then did was to do a meta-regression of these 122 studies, which were experimental or quasi-experimental in nature. Our sample represents evidence from more than 1.1 million households in 25 countries. We extracted 360 effect sizes and, of course, lots of control variables as well. And then we estimated different random effects and multi-level models to deal with heterogeneity issues and dependence issues. What are the results? Our first result is that actually all of the interventions we looked at, were effective. So all the results were significant, but there were differences, and particularly monetary incentive seemed to work best. An interesting result that also went beyond what was in the literature before is that we also looked at packages of interventions, and basically the key finding that we got from that was that we found that you can achieve more effective interventions when you package them in an appropriate way. So interventions that are well packaged can actually, in combination, have a higher, basically medium average effect size than if they are undertaken individually. And then finally, we also translated this into a mitigation wedge and found a modest potential of about 0.35 gigatons of CO2 per year that could be achieved via those. So that is really not a lot, right? Given that current emissions are at around, CO2 emissions are around 40 gigatons at the moment. So here we find 0.35 gigatons, but that said, the most effective interventions, if you consider households much more broadly, are those ones that Miriam talked about, where that is related to the weatherization of buildings, for example. So investments by households in their infrastructure. So where do we want to go from here? And this is something that I want to that I would like to end on. Coming back to this pyramid that I highlighted on my second slide, where evidence synthesis is basically thought of as a bridge between primary studies and assessments and broader science assessment as carried out, for example, by the IPCC. I think one of the things that we found is that we really need to answer bigger questions that single systematic reviews can answer. So the idea is now to go forward, as other people are doing, of course, already, to come up with an ecosystem of reviews that basically tries to answer a bigger question. So we would like to look at climate relevant behaviors of households in different areas. So most importantly, as we know from the literature, are buildings, transport, and food. So we would like to focus on those, and then basically have different reviews focusing on different aspects. So basically improving, for example, so switching, the equipment that we are using, efficiency improvements, but also our daily use behaviors, as we've done in the review here, and maintenance and adjustment of existing equipment or infrastructure, and basically investigate those in a series of reviews that would, on the one hand, then deal with the investment side that we haven't focused on, but also with the behavioral aspects. And I think the appeal of this would be to then combine them in a broad synthesis that for the first time, in my understanding, would provide rigorous evidence on the emission reduction potential of households and or lifestyle change. I'll stop here. For anybody who is interested, this is the page of the Campbell Group on Climate Solutions. Feel free to contact us on this as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jan. So actually, I wonder if perhaps you could say just a few words about the Campbell Group. I think that it's relevant for this platform and audience. And maybe you could, and this question I'd also invite Miriam and Martin to respond to. To what extent are there remaining synthesis gaps in this literature? I think that some of the consistent findings, I think, across different evidence mapping and synthesis pieces in this space is that actually there are issues with the primary evidence base. So the foundations of the pyramid are not necessarily there. So I think it would be good if you could comment on that and perhaps indicate if you think that there are specific areas where the foundations are there and what to do when they are not. Thank you.
So to start off with the Campbell Group, I mean, the main motivation of the Campbell Group is actually is related to IPCC assessments coming out of those of the 5th assessment report, which was published in 2014. People increasingly realized that actually we are learning well on certain things, mainly climate physics, on climate impacts, etc. But we are not learning well on solutions. So what policies, what interventions work under what conditions and why, this is what we really need to understand. And the knowledge that is forwarded now, also I can say as an author in the upcoming 6th assessment report is quite, what I would say, rather superficial. And that has to do with my personal perception of a community in the social science of climate change that is not well organized around evidence, around formal evidence synthesis, and that needs to change. And this is why we founded the Campbell Group. This is the ambition that we have, like, this was done in the health sciences, really to initiate a cultural change on this. And I think that is a big challenge. We will be organizing, we have plans to organize a big summit next year on this issue, where we would like to bring the two or the different communities together, the evidence synthesis community with the different collaborations and the, let's call them global environmental assessment communities with the IPCC. Some UN bodies like the UN emissions gap is very influential in that space, or IPBES the intergovernmental platform on biodiversity as major players in the field and start really an exchange and involve those communities in systematic and evidence synthesis activities. I think that that is really crucial.
Great, thanks, Jan. And then, if you and others on the panel would like to perhaps comment on or reflect on this point on what are remaining synthesis gaps, and what can or should we do when the foundations of to do synthesis are not there.
Yeah, thanks, Birte. I can jump in on this just quickly, and thank you, Jan, for your excellent presentation, and Miriam as well for the great summary. And so I think the starting point is really that the costs of mitigation are too great for the public sector to bear. So the private sector needs to play a greater role, and we know that this market is mature.
Sorry, Birte, shall I go? Or
Martin is talking.
Oh.
Okay, thank you. But apologies, Miriam. And so we know that these markets are mature for sort of energy efficiency, but for many other types of mitigation investments, these markets aren't mature, and there's sort of limited private sector, limited return generating opportunities within our other sectors. I mean, within developing countries, our evidence review highlighted that a real paucity of causal studies, and we weren't able to do any form of meta-analysis because of that. We had to rely on many non-experimental studies, but the studies that we did include at the household level, these were very much focused on alternative energy generation and agriculture. At the firm level, these were focused on energy efficiency, emission treatment equipment, transportation. But what was interesting when we did a synthetic review of the private sector investments in mitigation evidence review, almost all of the studies relied on public policy initiatives that were part of the enabling environment. So this is part of the regulatory framework. So these were particular types of incentives, tax incentives and others. So I think a really key question, and Miriam may want to speak to this, is what forms of public policy interventions, what types of regulatory frameworks and incentives can be offered what forms are most effective at leveraging private sector investments. And this may take the form of particular financial instruments or particular tax incentives or regulatory frameworks. Over. Back to you, Birte.
Great. Thank you, Martin. Miriam, do you want to come in?
Sure. I'm really sorry I couldn't hear Martin at all. So I hope to just don't repeat what he said. So in terms of evidence gaps, so gaps in the primary evidence, our EGM show that there are still a lot, and in particular there are some areas where we really don't have evidence. But as a general note, we didn't find much evidence on what we could call, I don't know, the power sector or business, industries and firms and public institutions. So we know there are some, but many were not in path evaluation, so we could include them. We found only a few of them. I think there were around 10 implemented in firms and businesses, and another 10 in public institutions. So this shows that they can be done, but really there were a small fraction of the 300 studies that we included in the map. So more studies beyond residential settings. We also found only a few studies looking at the effects of energy audits. We know there are some, they are well done, they're good in path evaluation, but there are only a few. And the same for capacity building and technical assistance. at the 3 levels. We didn't find many primary studies. At the outcomes level, we were particularly interested in one outcome that is called energy security. So the capacity of this intervention to ensure people have access to energy, perhaps because the cost of having energy, thanks to the energy efficiency interventions, is reduced. But we only found a few studies looking at it. We were also hoping to find some studies measuring this outcome in the systematic reviews, but that didn't happen. So there will be more need for more measurement of this outcome. And also the emissions. We know this is a long-term outcome, so probably is not directly measurable, but I think it would be useful to have, conversion of the, for example, the energy consumption reduction, converting how much emissions we are going to save. I think it would be useful to include that in the impact evaluations. And then finally, in terms of synthesis gaps, so we identified some. We tried to fill in one with our systematic reviews, Ian fill it another one with his big systematic reviews. But I think that there are some areas, for example, education campaigns, to, for example, motivate people to adopt energy efficiency interventions. I don't think there is a systematic reviews looking at this intervention, so that might be next coming up systematic reviews, perhaps. Thank you.
Jan, do you want to come in?
Yeah, if I could add two more thoughts to this. One is, I think if we now look at the broader field of climate policy, and this is something we are very interested here. I think there are now a growing number of studies that can actually be synthesized. So, for example, on carbon pricing, we are doing a systematic review at the moment, and there's really a lot of evidence, quite heterogeneous in terms of their study designs, but a lot, and again, an area where we try to do an ecosystem of reviews, and I think the same holds for other policy instruments like feed-in tariffs, etc. But all these, I think that is what I feel is really a constraint. There are not so many initiatives that try to assess those very systematically, and extremely few actually move into a meta-regression framework, even though the evidence is there. And I think that's really, really important. And I think there, as a community, we have to improve. And I think so. While I acknowledge completely there are lots of evidence gaps, there's also this broader evidence synthesis gap that is also actually rooted in a lack of capacity in many parts of the community to do this. The second aspect of the evidence base is also that it's like very interdisciplinary and mixed methods. So I think it's really, really important that as a community, as an evidence synthesis community, we really look at the whole portfolio of methods, of evidence synthesis methods, from qualitative to mixed methods to quantitative, because particularly in this mixed method and qualitative review space, there's almost even more work to do, because at least some economists have been using meta-analyses or meta-regressions, and there is some work that has been done, but in this other space there is almost no work, I would say, in terms of using really rigorous methodological frameworks.
Great, thanks, Jan. And I think that we're nearly at time, but I think that's also a nice, quite positive note to end on. So I think that a key takeaway from my perspective of this session is that whilst there are clearly areas of climate change interventions where we don't have enough primary evidence, there are increasingly pockets of literature and synthesis gaps, and both the Green Climate Fund and the Campbell Climate Solutions Group and 3IE are working on synthesis efforts to address this. And it's also really exciting to hear about your efforts, Jan, to bring together the different communities. So I'm looking forward to see how this develops, and hopefully the evidence synthesis community and others will come together and collaborate to make this happen. So thank you to the panel for your excellent presentations, and I wish you and the audience a great rest of the day and week at the What Works Summit. So I think if you now go to reception, you can access the rest of the program there. Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Birte.
Thank you, Miriam.